And that leaves the giant frontal lobe, which actually has quite a list of functions. First of all, get this one out of the way: motor, or specifically voluntary motor. So it is going to process information and send it to your muscles to tell you how to move. Um, so you may remember this from a previous video, that I talked about sensory information going up. Actually, I'll change colors here. Sensory information is information about the body from all of your senses, and it's going to go up into the brain and be processed by these various sensory areas, like that, including the insula, which is buried in there. And then you've got motor. So voluntary motor, it's actually going to be right there. You decide to move your finger, that information is processed here, and that motor information is then sent down to your skeletal muscles. So that information is processed in the frontal lobe. In addition to those things, in addition to voluntary motor, you also have, I've heard it called executive function, but it sounds very corporate. Executive just means to execute something, not like to kill it, but to like execute a plan. So actually planning, let's call it that. Planning, problem solving, what you think of as like, I guess, higher level cognition, what you do in a lot of your classes. That's all frontal lobe. Then, last thing, whatever you want to call this, I'm going to put it in quotes, personality, which is really hard to define. What does it mean to have a personality, and what are all the personalities out there? And there's, various measures in, say, psychology and elsewhere about the categories of personality types. Whatever that means, it seems to be in the frontal lobe. Evidence we have for this. Well, I'll tell you a story about somebody who had severe damage to their frontal lobe. His name was Phineas Gage. You do not need to know this for the exam, so just relax for a sec. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker in the late 1800s in Pennsylvania. And working on a railroad, you work with explosives around a lot because you might have to like blow up the side of a mountain in order to get the rail through a particular area. You might have seen this. It's also true of roads and stuff. It looks like part of a mountain has been blasted away. So Phineas Gage was working on a railroad, and he had this big, long metal rod. It was probably like 6 feet long. And it's called a tamping rod. And so he was tapping or tamping something down in a hole. And there were live explosives down there, like nitroglycerin, dynamite. And the tamping set it off. And the 6 foot long metal pole shot like a bullet. And it went through his head. It actually went through. So let me erase all this. So this big metal rod went through. You can imagine there's like an eyeball right here looking out at the world. And this metal rod went through his cheekbone, through his eye orbit. So the bony orbit would be around here, and there's the eyeball itself, right? So through the zygomatic bone, through the eye orbit, through the eye, up through the frontal lobe, and then shot out like, I heard it was like 30 feet or maybe more. It was like a bullet, a big long bullet, and it went straight through his frontal lobe. And the remarkable thing is he was conscious. So he's conscious, and he walks to the doctor's office, still awake, and the doctor, there's journals of the doctor's surprise when this man walks through his door, and he has a big hole in his head, and there's blood and brain matter pouring out of his head. So remarkable. He's conscious. And so the doctor patches him up the best he can. Phineas Gage did get an infection, not surprisingly, but remarkably, he recovered from that as well, without antibiotics, because they didn't have them at that time. So he recovers physically. He's lost an eye, but otherwise seems okay, except for this big personality shift that apparently happened. So prior to the accident, he was very serious. He was actually a foreman at the railroad, so he managed other employees. He always got to work on time. He was very meticulous. He was great at his job. And railroad construction would require somebody who's serious and detail-oriented and very committed to the work. Afterward, he was impulsive, hot-tempered. he'd go out all night drinking and get into fights and then, show up late for work if he showed up at all. So that was a big personality shift. He lost his job and he moved to Argentina to become a stagecoach driver, which actually, an impulsive, hot tempered person, that's probably a good career choice because stagecoach driving back in that day was a really dangerous job and you had to be pretty brave and impulsive. Anyway, so that is just one case. It's just a particularly remarkable case just because he was conscious through the whole thing. But there are many other examples of frontal lobe damage, either from like maybe a head injury or a stroke or something, in which people do go through a personality shift. So that one anecdote is not the only evidence we have, but it really does seem like whatever personality is, it's primarily located in your frontal lobe.